I feel like this is like a, a dire aspect that probably needs to be taught in journalism schools. I know it wasn't part of the program that I took, but I think that there has to be an appreciation for business models within the context of what we do now, because it's just not realistic, um, to say no, we aren't going to run advertorial, or I think there has to be ways to work together without crossing that line.
Absolutely.
Uh, it's been an incredibly controversial issue here for the last couple of years, especially where CBC, our public broadcaster, has been concerned.
Welcome to the News Nirvana podcast. I'm your host, Nick Parker. The News Nirvana podcast features conversations with media professionals from across the country, highlighting our ever-evolving business models and showcasing the strong and effective journalism produced each and every day. This podcast is made possible to you by the generosity of Blocks Digital. Blocks Digital empowers content producers to connect with their worldwide audiences at scale and continuously transform to achieve their business goals. Contact Blocks Digital today to learn more about how they can help you thrive, and you can connect with them at blocksdigital.com. Hello, and welcome back to the News Nirvana podcast. I'm your host, Nick Parker. With me this episode is Connie Thiessen, editor at Broadcast Dialogue in Canada. Connie, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm excited. We met a week or so ago, did a video call just to kind of introduce ourselves and talk. And the more I thought about it, the more I just got excited, because you get to do a lot of kind of the similar thing to what I'm doing, which is just talk to people in the industry and get their stories about what they're doing and what's going on. And so I'm really, really curious to get your take on what you're seeing in today's journalism world, and what people are doing media-wise. Tell us a little bit about Broadcast Dialogue and that podcast that you're doing.
Broadcast Dialogue has been around since the early 90s and was actually founded by a man named Howard Christensen, who was one of the original broadcast news anchors. Broadcast news was one of our national wire services. And so him and the initial editor, Barry Hamlin, who also came out of BN, formed this publication because they saw a need to sort of have cohesive and timely news out of the broadcast sector. And the publication continues today. We celebrated our 30th anniversary last year in 2022, but to this day, one of the most popular columns that comes out in our weekly e-edition is Revolving Door, which tracks all of the people moves in the industry, which, as you know, are frequent and sometimes hard to track.
Right.
And beyond that, we also write. We have a sign-offs column, which I write probably about, I would say, 200 obituaries a year for Canadian broadcasters, not just broadcasters, also people behind the scenes. Anybody basically who has a media or film production background will write, a professional obituary for them. Though that I think is what has kept the publication going over the years, in addition to all of the other news that we cover. So the weekly briefing has been around in various formats. It started as a fax that would come to radio stations, and I'm old enough to remember it coming over the fax when I was a really young reporter just starting out. But over the years it evolved into a glossy magazine, and then at one point it was a mail out, but also in a newsletter format. And in 2016, when Howard Christensen and his wife Ingrid were set to retire, and it looked like BD would fold, our current publisher, Sean Smith, stepped in and took the publication digital. And so a lot of I am actually not the first editor under the digital brand. That was held by a woman named Lisa Blackburn, who is a veteran of radio in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And she actually got elected to Halifax City Council. So she was the first digital editor of the publication in 2016. And when it came time for her to take up her council seat, our publisher said, Lisa, who's going to take over the publication? And she
I,
said, we had worked together, and she said, Connie's going to take it on.
so you're either
So
saying
I
thank you or you're mad at her.
it's one of those things where I think everything you have worked on up it, encompassing the breadth of your career, culminates into this job that just turns out to be a really good fit, because I have covered politics, and there this gig involves a lot of regulatory coverage. I've worked coast to coast, and so I have a really big network of people in the industry. And I've always been interested in tech and social media, and I think that this job is just it's the place where all of that intersects, and so it is a really good fit from that perspective.
I cannot imagine wanting to leave media for politics after covering politics. That
Yeah,
has zero
yeah.
appeal to me.
I have a lot of friends who've done it, and I think they're enjoying it. I mean, as an observer on the sidelines for a lot of years, you end up reading all of that material, all of those city council reports, and policy documents, and I think at some juncture, I can see, the urge to get in there and actually attempt to try to move things forward.
I could see other people wanting to do that. Well, let's talk a little bit about covering the media, about watching what's going on, throughout Canada in the media, and what you're seeing from your colleagues.
Well, we're coming out of the pandemic, obviously, and that was really rough on radio in particular, compounded by all of the other things that are happening with consumer choice and competition from digital. Um, I think that we're definitely on the rebound. I think that there are some issues that mirror what's happening in the US, particularly the question of foreign ownership, because we have a lot of what makes the Canadian media ecosystem unique is that we have a lot of integration from telecom. So our two biggest media conglomerates here in Canada are also in the telecom business. And so I think there has been a very clear message, particularly from Bell Media in the last few years, that media is a very small segment of that overall business and isn't necessarily a segment that's profitable enough to want to put a lot of money into. And so that leaves the Canadian landscape in sort of a precarious position. We have a lot of concentration of our media groups.
Yeah, that's a different twist on. I think everybody sees the corporate tightening, right? Tightening of the belt, but that makes it a little different too when it's the giant telecom company as well.
I think for me, it's opened up a lot of questions about radio ownership and who's really benefiting from being under the umbrella of a lot of these just gigantic publicly traded companies. A lot of radio stations, especially in small and medium markets in this country, started because it was a, isn't it great that we can have local news and someone come out to cover our local events and, have local people on air. And I think that that has been lost to a degree. I think there's a lot of musing in the industry about whether a lot of medium-sized organizations are going to end up, with more ownership of some of these smaller stations, just because from a publicly traded corporate standpoint, maybe the stations aren't profitable, but are they profitable, for to meet that bar that a Bell Media or Rogers might have?
So you're saying they need more of that Big Brother's money.
I think that there has been a propensity to think that year over year profit increases should be the norm. And I think that we have to get back to a place where, if you really want to be a media business, is it all about the profit? Journalism has always had benefactors. And I feel like we're kind of at a place where, if journalism is going to survive, it can't really be about that bottom line and the year over year return to shareholders. It has to be back to that place of, isn't it great that we still have this?
We've talked a lot over the last several episodes, really throughout since we started this podcast a couple of years ago, about that change in, 25 whatever years ago that I started in the business, right? And even before that, right, there was a
Yeah,
very thick, immovable brick wall between editorial and business in your
right.
in your
Yeah,
journalism. And that wall has thinned over the years. Some by necessity, some by just that's how it happened. But we've talked a lot about finding that balance between the two, and a lot of it's because now we need audience revenue is so important now. It's a different piece that we have to keep bringing in money to keep the business going, and it's especially more important as we go more toward digital, because just the dollar to dollar comparisons aren't the same.
right. I think we struggle with that here at Broadcast Dialogue as well. There is a firewall, but as a vendor to the industry in certain respects, I think now that I've been in the business, as long as I have much more of an appreciation for it than I did back when I was a young reporter. When you were asking me that question, I was totally thinking of this time that, one at the first station I worked at, where one of the sales guys came and attempted to interfere with something that was airing. And I remember being situated at our Newswire computer just in the right spot. He was standing in the hallway, that I was able to just put my foot out and shut the door. And
That's awesome.
and I'm very punk rock. Like, I am the first person to stand up, uh, for journalism. That's always my first thought. But now that I'm writing for a trade publication, I think I have much more appreciation for that balance. And I think that it's something that I feel like this is like a, a dire aspect that probably needs to be taught in journalism schools. I know it wasn't part of the program that I took, but I think that there has to be an appreciation for business models within the context of what we do now, because it's just not realistic, to say, no, we aren't going to run advertorial, or, I think there has to be ways to work together without crossing that line.
Absolutely.
Uh, it's been an incredibly controversial issue here for the last couple of years, especially where CBC, our public broadcaster, has been concerned because they launched a, uh, I guess you'd call it a paid or sponsored content arm. And I believe that most of those activities have been paused, but at one juncture, it was proposed that, some of their talent would be hosting, uh, you know, these these pieces. And the outcry was massive, as it should be. I think there's a line there. I think when the line gets blurred, that's the dangerous part of it.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a couple things there that we've talked about recently. You have to know both sides because you have to work together just to make revenue happen, right? The two teams have to work together. But the other thing is that as we see more and more startups happen, right? And you see people who, and I use myself as an example here, came up editorial, and then all of a sudden I'm trying to run my own.
That's right.
I never took business classes outside of what was required at the beginning of college. I mean,
Yeah.
there was no in journalism classes for me. There were no, hey, here's how you run the business. Here's how you be a publisher, or how all of that works. And I think, we need more of that so everybody understands the entire business and how it, and the ecosystem and how it operates and how it can survive.
Are you one of the journalists that can actually do math, Nick? Because, like, I know
Well,
we had to
only if we're talking about
we
sports.
had to we had to take economics in the program that I went to, but you've never seen a room full of journalists as panicked
Oh yeah.
as budget day, generally speaking.
Yeah, the first time I moved, to a job that was on the other side of the wall, those first budget meetings were scary for me because I hadn't done math outside of, sports statistics or election night, right? Like tabulating the votes. Like that was the most math we did. But yeah, no, so you've had to figure it out. Let's I want to shift over a little bit because I do want to ask you about some of the stories, and I just I saw this one right before we talked a couple of weeks ago, and you were able to talk to somebody about a cool audio story that just won a Pulitzer Prize, done by Gimlet Media, and I want to know kind of about that story and what you were able to learn.
Oh, I think you're talking about Stolen.
Yeah, stolen, surviving St.
Surviving
Michael's.
St. Michael's, yes. That is Connie Walker is a Canadian journalist who, did a lot of investigative work during her career here in Canada with CBC, and then a few years ago went to work for Gimlet in New York. And, she actually, that's a very personal story for her that starts out in a very interesting way because her father, who had survived, you know, residential school abuse, went on to become an RCMP officer and actually pulled over one of his abusers. And that's how that podcast starts out. It's a wonderful podcast. It won not just a Pulitzer but also a Peabody Award. Um, I think I talked about on our video chat last week. There's an interesting sort of side conversation here about Canadian stories and whether the future of telling Canadian stories is going to be in, um, you know, the hands of a lot of American producers, because that's not the first case of this. Chameleon Wild Boys won the top Ambie Award this year, and that's also a Canadian story about a couple of kids who showed up in the interior of British Columbia. I think it was about 10 years ago, and purported to have been raised in the wilderness. There's a lot of great Canadian stories. Whether all of them are being told by Canadian outlets is another matter. I think we're in the wild west of podcasting right now. I mean, I
We
think
kind of get
that's
to do
fair to
whatever we
say.
want.
We're in
But
the
in
wild
some
west of
ways,
podcasting.
I really enjoy it. And I do a local news one where I'm at as well. But I really like the freedom to storytell in so many different ways. I miss writing sometimes, but there's a lot more freedom and a lot more options in how you tell the story, or to even pair it with writing, right? To pair some audio with your writing, or pair some video, or do all the above. I really am enjoying the freedom of that.
I enjoy it too. I think I mentioned that one of the things I enjoy the most is that I don't have a consultant in my ear, other than maybe my publisher once in a while.
Right.
I don't have a consultant in my ear, asking me for more, or I like the pace of podcasting. Um, and I do like, that there aren't as many limitations on the product. I think that definitely there are people who come on our podcast specifically who probably don't get asked to do podcasts. And I know we've been the first podcast for a lot of people who maybe are not major market talent but have an interesting story to tell about their media journey.
Yeah, what do you enjoy, or I guess what are some good stories that you've found, of those media journeys? And I think, a lot of our audience is south of your border, right? In in the US. So I'm curious kind of what some of those media journeys are like that you're finding as you collect those.
Generally, I have to have a reason to ask somebody to come on the podcast. I think, some of the ones that come to mind, like last year, I think it was last year, we had a launch in Kelowna where one of our former radio executives decided that to buy and launch a new independent station, just because he just missed the business so much and wanted to be a true owner operator in the community where he was living. So after owning a network of stations, now he's got a station in Kelowna. um I interviewed somebody else in late December who had been, I don't know if you know about Canadian content um, regulations here, but our stations have to play a certain amount of Canadian musical selections.
Yeah.
So there's a guy who owns a couple of stations up in the far north who had been, slapped on the wrist for not playing enough Canadian music, but partly due to the fact that it's really complicated. The formula is really complicated, and so even though you're playing Celine Dion or Justin Bieber, who are Canadians by birth, depending on who produced the song and who wrote the song, that might not end up being a Canadian uh, piece of music technically. And so
The
he
artist, the
just
producer, the engineer all have to be.
exactly. And if you look at these, like, hip hop and pop songs now, there's like 24 credits on them. Um so this particular owner decided he was going to flip his station to all Canadian. And so, I love these little stories about innovative things that people are doing. one of the stations I write a lot about is 94.9 The Rock, which is in Oshawa in Greater Toronto. They just revived the all night radio format with one of our former Much Music icons, Ed the Sock, because, no one's doing all night DJ formats anymore. Not here.
I
Um,
it's all automated now.
yeah. So they've just revived that. And it's in its early days. But I like stories of people trying new things and risk taking, because I think over the years the industry has gotten extremely risk averse, and it's been to its detriment.
The News Nirvana podcast is made possible by the generosity of Blocks Digital. Blocks Digital empowers content producers to connect with their worldwide audiences at scale and continuously transform to achieve their business goals. Contact Blocks Digital today to learn more about how they can help you thrive. Connect with them at blocksdigital.com. Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think we're finding that a lot of times it is these smaller independent organizations that are willing to kind of take those bigger risks. I, maybe not financial risks, but bigger risks as far as how they're gathering and producing content and delivering content.
Yes, I would tend to agree with that. We have had some really great so I'm sure you're familiar with the stunt format last summer that launched the Sonic Radio brand in Vancouver. And it's owned by Rogers Sports and Media, but they played Rage Against the Machine in a loop to launch the station without a lot of information, which went global. The industry needs more of that. There's
Right.
this sort of famous promotions stunt that happened here in Vancouver, where there was an album release and somebody drove a tank down West Georgia Street and parked it out in front of Fox, I think. It predates me, but like I
Well, my
feel
first question is, where does one get a tank?
I feel like the industry needs more of that, and we've lost it. A lot of it has to do with
Well, my first question is, where does
budget constraints, but part of what made radio great and was that edge.
well, you obviously you come from radio, you cover a lot of radio. We've talked about podcasting too. What's that relationship between those two delivery systems, you think? Is one pulling from the other? Are they helping each other?
They're still finding their way. As far as the public broadcaster is concerned, CBC Podcast is doing incredibly well. I believe CBC Front Burner, their daily podcast, is still the most listened to Canadian produced podcast. The most listened to podcast in Canada. Do you have any guesses?
Guesses. Is it broadcast dialogue?
It's
Oh,
Dialogue. It's NBC Dateline, which might surprise you,
I have zero
like the top
log.
podcasts, from a Canadian produced perspective, are predominantly CBC entities that are radio programs that have been reproduced for the podcast format. I think I'm in downtown Vancouver, so any matter of things could be happening outside. So I apologize for the sirens. Uh,
News.
sure. Um, at any rate, yes.
I just think of
There's
it as breaking.
a lot of our most listened to podcasts are generally American. Smartless performs really well, um, which technically has a Canadian on it, Will Arnett. Um, but yeah, I think everybody's still trying to find their way in, in terms of where that relationship between radio and podcasting really is going to make a dent. I think that most stations are offering some content on demand now was good. It's really nice to see that we are not having to have those conversations that we were having in 2019 pre-pandemic about online presence because prior to the pandemic, when we crossed that 50% streaming threshold for radio, I think we were
Right.
having to have all of these crazy discussions about whether your station should be online and whether you should be producing a podcast. I think all of those conversations have now advanced to another level, and I'm really, really happy about that.
Right, right. I think for the holdouts, the decision was made for them by the pandemic. I mean,
Yes, I mean, I think if you're relying solely on your your over the air signal now, I would question your business model. Um, I'm sure there are a few holdouts, but um,
well, yeah. I mean, even for content, you got to meet your audience where they're at, and even for your advertising, your business partners, you've got to help them meet the audience where they're at, and it's all on streaming.
yeah, and those are absolutely the discussions that the industry is having. BC Association of Broadcasters just had their first incarnation since the pandemic 2 weeks ago, and it was very much a digital first conversation. And the conversation is being had at all levels of the industry. In part because the Online Streaming Act has begun public consultations as it makes its way into cohesive policy, and that will determine what obligation foreign streaming entities have to produce Canadian content. And I know that's a theme, and in this conversation,
You've brought it up a couple times, and I'm curious what the some of the background context is there.
it's what we write about, um often, and to the chagrin of a lot of broadcasters, because we just had a radio review completed in December, and it didn't have a lot of substantial change for radio broadcasters where Canadian content obligations are concerned, but there definitely is huge concern about the impact that digital is having on broadcasters, and not just broadcasters, print media as well. And um, Canadian content contributions, I think, a lot of this is concern about Canadian stories or Canadian programming or Canadian point of view getting lost in the shadow of all of this global content.
Are there efforts by Canadian media organizations to go and start like to increase collection of those stories?
I think everybody's resources, I mean, there are obligations. So the Online Streaming Act will put those obligations onto foreign streamers with what they're proposing is with revenues over 10 million annually. So that would, encompass Netflix, YouTube TV, anything streaming in Canada that is in excess of that. OTT access revenue is forecast to grow 18% according to the latest convergence report in Canada, and I think it was up 23% this past year, and that's mostly foreign digital. I mean, when you look at the individual revenue of all of those streamers, they're all still individually below the 10% threshold in terms of their penetration. But I mean, it's a huge, huge piece of the share pie. And I think that's a concern. The question that comes up is when you have streamers like BritBox, for example, where do they fit into this? Like BritBox, how why would BritBox have Canadian content? I don't know. Maybe they just pay into a fund, but
because that's obviously that's not their lane.
no, it's not. And I think that argument could probably be made for a lot of really niche offerings. But
Right.
those are the conversations that are going to be had as part of these public policy consultations.
You in your role just to follow along and keep up on those stories and how that happens, and then obviously then informing everybody. I
I
feel like those
mean,
would be
it's
fun for
it's
you.
it's definitely interesting. We actually, our publisher acquired another publication, cart.ca, last summer, which is more based in regulatory. And so this relieves a lot of pressure on me as an editor, on my side, just because I can let them get deep into the regulatory weeds, and I can stick to our lane, which is more about format and programming and production.
I'm looking at our clock, and so I want to be cognizant of your time. And as we wrap things up, just a couple of things that I want to make sure we get to. What are as you're looking ahead to the future? What are some things that you're looking forward to covering in the production world there in Canada?
Radio Days North America, which is the first incarnation of the Radio Days Europe conference in North America, is happening in Toronto in early June. And so there's going to be a lot of discussion about AI. Of course, Daniel and Standig from Futuri is going to be doing a keynote about uh, Radio GPT. I don't know if you've heard about this product, but
I,
um,
I am fascinated by all of these.
so you can basically program an entire station using artificial intelligence. And if for people who are familiar with Futuri's software, like it can actually scrape the internet for topical content, based on what's trending on social media, and create a script, you know read by AI generated voices. So, I mean, this is in its infancy right now. I don't know if you're familiar with the recent Drew Carey controversy. So he tried out some type of AI powered solution on his Sirius XM show, which was kind of a failure. Like, I think it was clear that it was Drew Carey the robot, not Drew Carey the human. It a conversation about uh radio as a medium, which was always meant to be a source of human
Right.
connection, and now you've introduced robots. And so we're going to be able to you know talk to Futuri about that. But
Well, I think I think
it,
that's a common conversation. I think everywhere where we're talking about AI, right, is figuring out, okay, this is cool, this is fascinating. I want to play with all the toys, but also how do we actually use the tool to make what we do better? Right. I think that's
Yeah, at the last conference I was at, Valerie Geller, who's a well-known consultant in the industry, said, like, "I live in LA. If there's an earthquake, do I care? If AI is telling me, what's closed, what's open, what's the weather, or no, I don't." So, there are probably moments where AI could be a vital resource. Can it replace on-air talent? And this is coming up totally in the WGA strike as well, because a lot of production and talent contracts now are like, we can use your voice in any way, you know, any way we deem
right. Yeah.
fit. And so people are concerned, particularly voiceover talent, about what that means for the future of the industry.
Right. Right. Well, the last thing I want to get from you is if people want to follow along Broadcast Dialogue, they want to follow you on the social medias. How can they do that?
Broadcastdialogue.com. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Broadcast Dialogue, the podcast, is available on all of the major streaming platforms.
I'm a big fan of that. I don't like the podcasters who choose just one. I get it if you get paid a lot of money to just do one, but those are few and far between. But I really like people putting them out. Yeah.
I agree. Be where your audience is, as you mentioned.
Awesome. Well, Connie, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me.
That'll wrap us up for this episode. We'll talk to everybody next time. The News Nirvana podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or most any of your favorite podcast apps. The News Nirvana podcast is made possible by the generosity of Blocks Digital. Connect with them at blocksdigital.com. The News Nirvana podcast is produced by Fredcasts. Think, speak, act,